For context, this is an excerpt from the Proverbs given by prominent philosopher, feminist, and theorist from the 1990s, Sadie at the Body in the Virtual World conference in 1994. I found this speech incredibly interesting, as the nature of it being over 25 years old doesn't bar it from being more relevant than ever. In the age of the metaverse and digital currency domination, it emphasizes the importance of unity between body and mind, whilst inspecting our desire to digitalize. This excerpt does include things that are somewhat obsolete, which is to be expected from such an idiosyncratic source. Furthermore, this is but a small piece of a 44-minute dissertation given by Sadie Plant. Also, let it be known that I transcribed this from a YouTube video, so the flow and sentence structure might be slightly off. So, as the viewer, I ask that you contextualize the information as best as possible. Thank you. But first of all, on this question of cyberspace itself being supposedly immaterial, a matter of symbolism, metaphor, an imaginary zone. This is really the tendency to make cyberspace, thus to make many things, into a matter of metaphor or representation. This is really a matter of repeating the great idealist project, which has characterized Western patriarchal culture, which has always been an attempt to somehow climb out of matter, to get into some immaterial zone. Such a zone would be both insubstantial and ineffectual, those two senses of the word immaterial. And we can see this with cyberpunk itself, even after there's been so much said about the collapse of the distinction between social reality and science fiction. The people still want to make cyberpunk itself into simply a matter of fiction, again, a metaphor, somehow, for our times. And this even after we've seen the real effect in the world, which cyberpunk has obviously already had. Even the body, finally, in this high-tech world, somehow gets back onto the agenda, or perhaps onto the agenda for the first time, but again, it's a matter of metaphor. Even this session today is called The Body of Metaphor. Metaphor for what is the question that I want to really be asking. And this tendency to turn everything into immateriality is really, as I say, an old trick of Western patriarchy. Cyberspace can, of course, always be seen, and has been seen largely, as the fulfillment of this great dream, again, of getting out of the meat, of getting out of matter. As I say, it's an ancient dream. It really goes back as far as to the sort of sources of Westerners' philosophy, with Socrates who himself says, if anyone is to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by ourselves with the soul by itself. So Socrates, and consequently the whole history of Western culture, has really dreamt of some notion of the soul being separate and independent of the body. He says, it seems as long as we're alive, we'll continue closest to knowledge if we avoid as much as we can or contact and association with the body except when absolutely necessary, and instead of allowing ourselves to become infected with its nature, purify ourselves from it, until God Himself gives us deliverance. That is very much an attempt to purify, to escape from the body, to escape its contamination. As I say, it's inevitable that cyberspace would of course be welcome into this sort of culture as the ultimate chance to finally make this escape from the meat, or as I say, to become simply a symbolic zone, an immaterial zone. Finally, we get to the great dream of the Western culture, the body as a metaphor, finally removed from all its visceral activity, its blood and guts, and all the messy stuff that man would rather have left behind. And so cyberspace does really obviously feed this dream for total control, for autonomy, for the perfect end of the great Western patriarchal project, the great resolution of the masculine identity crisis, the point at which the soul would finally be united with itself. And of course all this has been encouraged in fiction and in films and so on by series, like for example, Oliver Stone's Wild Palms by The Lawnmower Man. Again, all these great dreams of immortality, of becoming God, are finally making it into a pure, insubstantial, omnipotent sense of identity. Now, of course, the whole notion of the virtual and of cyberspace is indeed a part of, and from the human perspective, it has indeed been produced by this very desire for total control, for final autonomy, for the escape from the meat in that sense. But it too has also been programming the human identity, which has been seeking this. No one, it turns out, actually escapes from the meat. Instead, it's a matter of getting caught up with it. The body, it turns out, is never left behind. Instead, it's the body which itself begins to learn how to disentangle itself from all constraints. Again, we can see this in all the sorts of cultural fallouts, from cyberspace and VR to drugs and cybersex. There's a convergence of all these sort of outlaw channels on which the body, which Socrates was quite happy to dismiss as merely some sort of vehicle, some carrier for man's great dreams, sort of the raw materials for his own adventures. The body begins, now, to return in a very different form to this empty, vacuous shell which was left behind in the past. And now we can see this great dream, as well as the whole of Western patriarchal culture, really heading into crisis.